All right, deer season is fleeting for this year, and here are 4 key things to keep in mind to make the most of the rest of the season. It's a clip from the Exodus podcast. Hope you guys enjoy this. Here we go.
That ties into one thing that I actually wanted to talk about in this episode, and that's a mistake that I've made in the past, and that is thinking almost that same exact scenario, right? You get a picture of a deer infrequently. I'll call it infrequently. Like, so whether that's every 3 or 4 days, maybe it's once a week, maybe it's like once a month, or once every couple of weeks. But in the past, in my mind, everybody talks about hunting cold fronts. Everybody talks about food sources in the late season. And you would see these big weather fronts roll in. And in my mind, I'm like, all right, this deer is going to magically just show up on this food source, even though I've only seen him 3 or 4 times on camera, but there's a giant cold front coming. Everybody talks about it. He's going to be there. And you go out and you hunt the backside of the front, or the front side and the backside, and nothing happens. And not only did it not work, did I not see him from the stand, but I had no camera pictures of him at the same point. It's one of those things where if you don't have that deer on some type of pattern, if you don't have information about that deer, he is not magically just going to show up because it's 0 degrees out. I'm sure you can get lucky once every blue moon or something and have one show up like that, but the majority of the time it's not going to work.
No, so the key to that is continue to scout with your cameras. You have to have that camera in the right spot. You have to be where that deer wants to be able to capitalize on where he's going to be when that cold front moves in. What are the key, what do you look for? What's the key? When do you know when it's time to strike? If you have that deer coming in 45 minutes after dark, he's coming to your food source, or maybe it's an hour after dark, he's coming to your food source. What are the things that you're looking for in the forecast to know, okay, when this hits, that's when it's time to go?
The trigger that I think that I've looked for in the past, and I think just even from running, a large number of cell cameras the last few years, wind speed is a giant deal. I think last year was probably, maybe it was 2 years ago. 2 years ago was the first aha moment about wind speed, like watching cell cameras shut off and light up based on wind speed. So wind speed, obviously temperature drop is one of them. I think precipitation is also on that list, but I think it's probably the third. If I were to rank these and prioritize them, I think wind speed, temp drop, and then precipitation is probably the third thing I look for. But with all of these things, and to the point about scouting that I want to mention is how bedding changes. Don Higgins talks a lot about the biology of a deer. Maybe not a lot, but I've heard him talk about this in the past, from having that deer farm, from him paying close attention to their feeding habits, and then the biology of a deer and how its metabolism actually slows down in the winter. So a lot of people have this, and when I say a lot of people, myself included, until I did a little more learning, a little more research, a little more listening, a little more reading on the topic. It's like, okay, these deer have just gone through the rut, the breeding phase, and they need to eat more to, I guess, rehab their body, like nutrition. They need to have more nutrition intake. And what Don was talking about on that topic was that that's something that he did not see in his private deer farm when he was just monitoring and watching these deer. They weren't necessarily feeding more or consuming more food as the temperature dropped because their metabolism is changing, but they would move earlier in the day based on different weather triggers. I think that's one important thing to keep in the back of your mind. And then 2 is going back to how bedding changes. I think that there's 2 things there. One is obviously security. So that is pressure still number 1. But then also thermal protection that bedding offers. We've talked about this in the past as you see bedding shift change as habitat changes. I do think that bedding hierarchy, it shrinks a ton when it gets into these late season, into these cold temperatures. I think that deer start to kind of group back up, and you see multiple bucks with a lot of other deer. So that I don't know if they become more social per se, but I do think it's just based on trying to conserve energy, and that bedding structure becoming a hell of a lot closer to food than what it normally was. So when you start hunting those food sources, and I think that's what most guys tend to gravitate towards, is like it's an easy ambush. Like, they're coming to food. Like, that's the end game usually in the late season. And rather than going and pushing the envelope If you can kill them on a field edge, like, you don't have to go to the bedding. That's kind of the route that I've taken in the past, and I haven't had a whole lot of success in the big woods. Going back to, cover and the bedding structure changing, like, it's security and thermal protection, I think, are the two biggest things. But with that, if you do have to move closer to bedding, I do think you need to be able to change your setups compared to their early season.
Oh yeah.
Heath talked about this.
Lowering in the tree.
Yeah. Typically in the late season, it seems like winds are a little more consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's because there is less foliage, there's, less obstruction there. But being lower in that cover, I think, probably is even more critical than what it normally is, just because of the lack of cover and the pressure that have been added to those deer or negative encounters that they've had with hunters over the last couple months.